root of the situation and expose it in the most challenging way possible. I finished the leaflet, and now I'm going to show you the leaflet. You can just pass these out. I hope there's enough. Please share if there aren't.
Thank you.
Ben, do you have any more? Mine was further back here. I couldn't tell if you had another pile or.
I don't have another
Okay,
pile,
that's fine,
so
that's fine.
if you, later on, maybe we can make more copies. The leaflet is in this book, if you get the book, and it's on my website, so maybe if you've seen it, you can pass it on to people further in the back so they can look at it. So anyway, this was the leaflet that I had printed 100 copies. I finished the leaflet just before the reading, and I had 100 copies printed. As I approached the auditorium, nervously clutching them under my arm, I became hesitant. Wasn't this too extreme? How did I dare attack Gary Snyder this way? He himself was more or less an anarchist. He wasn't trying to recruit anyone to anything. He wasn't even charging any money. Had I gone off the deep end? I decided to sit down and listen to the beginning and see what it felt like. So I'm in the back row. There was an audience of several hundred people. This was up on the UC campus. Snyder started off by saying that before he got underway with the poetry, he'd like to, quote, say a few words about the revolution, unquote. He made a few remarks on that topic, which were a bit vague, but not bad. When he finished, the audience applauded. That did it. Nothing could have made the spectacular nature of the whole occasion more clear. The applause was the glaring sign that his words would not be taken up practically, but would merely serve as one more tidbit for passive titillation. People would probably go home after the reading and tell their friends, he not only read a lot of great poems, but he even said some far-out stuff about revolution. I was outraged at the situation. The most insulting aspects of my leaflet were only too appropriate. I took them out, threw them into the crowd, and ran away. I had no further interest in anything Snyder might say, and I did not wish the incisiveness of my act to be diluted by a debate with the audience as to what alternatives I had to propose. That was their problem. People sometimes ask if situationists, quote, do anything, or if they, quote, just write. I had had this same misconception. I had felt that I wasn't sure what to do, but that meanwhile it might be helpful to write the leaflet in order to clarify matters. It was only afterwards that I realized I had done something. If a critique really stirs even a few people to stop and think, to see through some illusion, to reconsider some practice, perhaps even provokes them to new ventures of their own, this is already a very worthwhile and practical effect. How many, quote, actions, unquote, do as much? I saw that the insistence on being constructive was just a shuck that intimidated people from confronting their own condition, and that a critique, as opposed to a self-righteous moral condemnation, need not imply one's own superiority. If we had to be better than others before criticizing them, the so-called best people would never be criticized at all. And hierarchs tend to define the issues in such a way that they remain on top. It didn't matter how talented or wise or well-intentioned Snyder was. If the purpose of poetry is to change life, I felt there was more poetry in my act than in any poem he might read that evening. I will be the first to admit this particular intervention was inept and probably had no notable effect on anyone but myself, though the leaflet was clear enough in attacking passive consumership of culture. The social perspective on which that attack was based was only vaguely implied. The action was also a flop as a disruption. I had searched in vain for some balcony-type place from which I could drop the leaflets over the whole audience, so as to create a critical mass situation in which everyone would be intrigued into reading them at the same time. I could have achieved the same result a little less dramatically by barging through all sections of the audience. Nowadays, I would think nothing of doing that, but back then I was new at the game and I didn't have the nerve. As a result of my more timid distribution, just flinging them from the back, only a fraction of the people got the leaflets, and as I was later told by some friends who were there, after a few seconds' pause, the reading continued, with most of the rest of the audience probably assuming that it was merely some run-of-the-mill leaflet about black studies or the Vietnam War. But whatever effect my action had on the audience, it was very illuminating for me. As I ran from the auditorium, I felt like a child again, as excited as a grade school kid playing a prank. My real breakthrough in grasping the situationist perspective dates from that moment. I had already learned a lot from reading situationist texts, and from the example of the CEM, who, after sharply criticizing my previous confusions, had wisely left me on my own to work out what I was going to do next, and from my experiments over the previous months. But pulling the rug out from my own passivity and star worship had the most liberating effect of all. The fact that I had picked what was for me just about the hardest conceivable target made the experience the biggest turning point of my life. The CEM members were aware of my admiration for Snyder. When I later showed them the leaflet, one of them said, I see you've been subverting yourself as well as others. We all grinned. So, is everyone okay? Not too
Yeah, what are we supposed to
do? So, after that, so that's in 1970. And that was, as I said, a kind of turning point. Like, from there on, I was thoroughly into the situationist scene. I started learning French. I went to France to meet some of these people, and eventually became good enough that I could translate it. And some of Ron and some of my other friends formed some groups in the Bay Area, and we did a few little scandals and disruptions and so on. And I'm going to kind of go through several years much more rapidly now. Just as I say, there were various groups there. Sometimes they broke up. Sometimes there were traumatic splits, so on. But in the process, I continued this initial focus that you saw in this of looking at what I was doing. And this is not a specifically situationist kind of thing, although situationists are generally very critical and observant. But because of that experience that I had with that Snyder disruption, I really had a gut feeling from then on in my life, up till now, 40 years later, that of the importance of engaging in this kind of challenge to oneself. That when I was confronted with some situation, sure, I could say objective things, oh, this is how that works, and this is mistaken, and things that we're usually more used to in political polemics. But I also paid a lot of attention to what's going on in me now. Not just do I feel good or something kind of vague like that, but what are the dynamics going on here? What's going on in my relations with people when this happens? If I do this and I feel real excited, then if I do something else and I get suddenly depressed, looking at these kind of fine points was something that was kind of one of my main themes from that moment, really. And a few years later, I wrote a little pamphlet called Double Reflection that was precisely about that. It's basically the first reflection is reflecting on what you're going to do out there, and then the second reflection is looking at how that relates to you. Sort of turning inward and then going outward and turning inward again, so on. So that maybe I'll read just a little bit of Double Reflection just as a sample, but not very much. Here is near the beginning of the pamphlet. I'm talking about this activity, like looking at what we call practical critical activity. That's a Marx term. In other words, activity that's active, but it's critical at the same time. And I say it's about time we looked into this activity. What does it consist of? What does it do to us who do it? Whereas the sociologists study man as he is normally, that is, reduced to survival, a sum of roles, a sum of banalities, we are going to study him when he acts to suppress all that, homo negens, as opposed to like negating man. Quote, by acting on external nature to change it, he at the same time changes his own nature, unquote. That's from Capital. The alienation of the proletariat consists in this. His work has substance but no freedom. His leisure has freedom, but no substance. What he does of consequence is not his, and what he does that is his has no consequences. Nothing is at stake in his play. Hence the appeal of all those dangerous games like gambling or mountain climbing. It is this social schizophrenia, this desperately felt need to see their own action, to do something that is really theirs, which causes masses of people to take up crafts or vandalism, and still others to try to suppress the split by attacking the separation in a unified way, by taking up coherent vandalism, the craft of the negative. What does it feel like? You already know, reader, or at least you once did. It's like when you share a secret or pull off a beautiful prank. Only this feeling is shoved to the margin of life so that its image can take center stage. It ends up being forgotten. Well, we don't want to forget. A revolution is the most practical joke on a society that's a bad joke. And then here's part from the end of the pamphlet. The forces that want to suppress us must first understand us, and that is their downfall. The unconsciousness of the spectacle already puts it at our disposal to a certain extent. as if we suddenly had the cities all to ourselves, like a child running through the silent ruins in a Chirico painting. When you deturn a film, an ad, a building, a subway, you demystify its apparent impregnability. Just for a moment, you dominated it. It is just an object, just technology. We are still experimenting in the dark. The most powerful weapon this society possesses is its ability to prevent us from discovering the weapons we already have, how to use them. We have to practice a global resistance analysis, that's a Wilhelm Reich term, on the society itself, interpreting not only its content, but its resistances to the interpretation. Each subversive action is experimental, like a move in the children's game. You're getting warmer, you're getting colder. We're groping. It is by making history that you learn to comprehend it. By playing against the system that you discover its weaknesses, where it lashes back. In the final analysis, that's really what the dérives were all about. That was a situationist thing in the 50s. Is it entirely coincidental that the modern critique of urbanism and the spectacle issued from the psychogeographical researches of the 50s? One learns most precisely how the system operates by observing how it operates on its most precise enemies. So that's a little pithier than the autobiography, so there may be some things there that you didn't follow, but not to worry. Oh yes. Okay, so in 1973, following some tumult that I won't go into, I found myself back on my own. The group I was in was dissolved, but I was still very much involved in these kind of things. And I was one day I was reading a Raymond Chandler novel, and in that Philip Marlowe says, "I gave him one of my cards, the one that didn't have a gun on it." And I thought, I should have a card. So here is what I came up with. I'm sorry I don't have the original cards. There are only a few left. But these are copies, and again, you can just pass them around. Maybe you can just, period when I and some of my friends were in a very tumultuous, lively mode. And I describe that again in considerable detail in this book. And just as one example, we had been having great times together, kind of on a personal level, but also discussing political things and doing things. But at a certain point, I wrote a letter to them saying, okay, we're doing all this stuff. We've got all these kind of Reichian things. We've got, we're doing psychoanalytical things, sort of almost encounter groupish things. But let's not get too stuck in this. We're all aware that, there's the broader thing there. And so my thing was just a letter to them, but their response was beautiful. This is a perfect example of taking it one step further. Their response to me was this poster. It says, "We're tired of playing with ourselves." And this is a picture of my three friends, Isaac, Danny, and Jan. And I'm not going to go into it farther, but this was, they came out with this at the same time that I had come out with this translation of a work about Wilhelm Reich, and I had made a comic about that, which is in there somewhere, but I can't find it at the moment. And so we thought, oh, we have these two posters that we did independently without even planning it, and so let's go out, and we pasted hundreds of these all over the Bay Area. And as a result, we met a whole lot of people. It was it's just one little.
What year was that?
This was '73, and so just one little episode there. So then in the late '70s, we had some more splitting up where I was more on my own again. And so I said, well, this is a good time. I had been studying Japanese a little bit, and I thought this is a good time to go to Japan. So I took a crash course up at Cal, Japanese, and then went to Japan for 2 months because I knew some Japanese anarchists there who I stayed with. And also went to Hong Kong. There was an anarchist group there. And came back and in each case wrote a critical thing, which again is, all these things are in that book, basically. And so that's 77, 78. In 79 I wrote a poster about the Iranian River. Thing about the 1979. No, it's fine, thanks. Then in 1980 and 81, I worked on the Situationist International Anthology because nobody else seemed to be translating these things, and so I thought I would do them, and I proposed it to a lot of different publishers, and no one was interested. They said this is too obscure, or whatever. So I ended up publishing it myself, and it's been selling solidly ever since. But even though I'm just a one-person publishing company, and then when I had that done, I kind of felt a sense of completion there. To a certain extent, I had been, the main stuff was out there and so on, and I felt like doing new stuff. So during the 80s, I got into rock climbing for a couple years, which was great. I loved it. And then towards the late 80s, I got back into Rexroth, which I had sort of put on the shelf during all the Situationist interest, and wrote a little book about him called The Relevance of Rexroth, also included in this, but it's a separate book. And I also got back into Zen practice, and started going to Berkeley Zen Center a lot, and which I've continued to do the last 25 years, and went to Tassajara Mountain Monastery in 1988 for 3 months. So those are kind of three things that I didn't really plan it that way, but when I look back, the Situationists and Rexroth and Zen are like these three incompatible influences on my life. They overlap in some ways and they contradict each other in some ways. And part of what I've been doing even before then, but since, is trying to say, well, how could this mesh with this? Which things of Rexroth are da-da-da, where does the Situationists go wrong, or how does Zen fit in with this? And I'm still working on it, but I think to some extent I've made some connections there. Then into the 90s, Wrote a thing about the Gulf War called The War and the Spectacle, and wrote a critique of socially engaged Buddhism once I was kind of into that scene. And 93, I was reading Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, and I got all nostalgic about my own life, and I thought, oh, I'm going to see if I can remember stuff about my childhood and all that. And so I started writing on it, and it was fascinating. You know, it was like a detective story, kind of trying to figure out what year was that, or who did I know in third grade, or what did it. And I just kept going and going and going without any plan of publication. And then at a certain point I thought, well, this would be interesting to publish, except that I'll have to leave out people's names and a few things like that. And that project, by sort of getting my life into this one form, helped me to get a bunch of other stuff that I'd been making notes about over the years into its form. Because it didn't, before then I had just had a lot of notes about revolution and radical strategies and so on like that. But somehow, you know how if you clean up one room in your house, it's easier to clean another room, and it inspires you to do that. So doing that one little thing brought this other thing together, and then I thought, hey, I could make a whole book because I've got all these old things. And so that's what Public Secrets is, basically. All my old writings and those two new writings in the 90s. And I'm going to read. Is everybody doing okay at this point? Getting antsy, bored? It's a little cooler. Warm, I'm sure.
We're still alive.
You're still alive. I'm going to read just two or three briefer passages from this other main text, which is called The Joy of Revolution. This text, as I say, it was kind of a summing of, I was looking back through 20 years or more of my experiences and trying to put them in a very pithy but easily understandable format. So it's in 4 chapters. The first chapter, the 4 chapters are called Some Facts of Life, Foreplay, Climaxes, Rebirth. And the first chapter is just kind of a prelude that introduces the topic of revolution and objections people have and what do you mean by it and so on. Then the second chapter is about so-called ordinary situations, which is most of what we live. It's things that you might do when nothing much is happening. And the third chapter, Climaxes, is about extraordinary situations. And these are rare, but they're very important. They're very dynamic when they do happen. It's called radical situations or even revolutions, where things are kind of up in the air and things that would not be normally practical suddenly become practical. And then the fourth chapter, Rebirth, is about after the revolution. That's supposing the kind of revolution I'm talking about, which is substantially what the situations we're talking about, happened. How would it work? What do you do about crime? What do you do about all these different things? And so I'm going to go through the contents in a little bit of just so you can get some sense of this, and then I'm going to stop and read at a certain point. In the first chapter, Utopia or Bust. These are the titles of the sections. Stalinist communism and reformist socialism are merely variants of capitalism. Representative democracy versus delegate democracy. Irrationalities of capitalism. Some exemplary modern revolts. Some common objections. And the second chapter, which is about ordinary situations, personal breakthroughs, critical interventions, theory versus ideology, the insurrectionary style, radical film, oppressionism versus playfulness, the Strasbourg scandal, that's a situationist thing, the poverty of electoral politics, reforms and alternative institutions, political correctness or equal opportunity alienation, drawbacks of moralism and simplistic extremism, advantages of boldness, advantages and limits of nonviolence. And the third chapter about radical situations, we have causes of social breakthroughs, effervescence of radical situations, that's what I'm going to read from, popular self-organization, the free speech movement, the situationists in May '68, worker